Hi everyone, good evening once again. It's Tuesday night, time for another webinar on how to manage tantrums in children. Thank you for joining me, my loyal companions. This is the 7th and final session in our course. So that's pretty exciting, and a big congratulations to you if you've attended or viewed the recordings of all or most of these sessions so far. That's a big commitment, and I want to acknowledge the effort that you've put in so far, and hopefully it's going to make a real difference to you in managing your child's behaviour. So I'm Tony Gates. I'm from the Parenting Research Centre and Raising Children Network. I'm a psychologist by trade, and we're going to be talking about functional assessment tonight. Now, we're not going to go through in detail the whole of the approach because there have been 6 previous sessions. If this is the first one you've been able to attend, then strap yourselves in for a wild ride because there's quite a lot to this approach, and I'd encourage you to go back and view the recordings and the handouts that come around by email. So tonight we're talking about planning a complete approach for your family. There's actually about 10 or 15 minutes of new content, and then the rest is going to be going through kind of a process to work out where you're up to and trying to guide you through implementing changes in your family. So I'm very conscious of the fact that this is the last chance I get to talk to you, at least directly, and I want to make sure you're kind of set up for success. But as always, I want to do a couple of acknowledgements just as we start. The first is to the Victorian government for funding this project, which is why we're able to bring it to you free of charge all around Australia and indeed the world. Possibly we have had international people joining us, so that's great to see. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting tonight. For myself and Kim here in Melbourne, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people we may have joining us tonight. Now, I did mention, well, I'll mention this first. If you are concerned or upset about managing a child's behaviour or other aspects of family life, or anything that the content we discussed tonight might bring up for you, please do seek support. There are some options on the screen there. They're all free. They're all nationally available. Don't just sit on it and feel like there's nothing that can be done. The best I can do is offer you some general advice. It's not going to help you that much if you're really distressed. So, as always, seek out those supports if you need to. Now, let's just recap where we're up to in the course. Remember, it is interactive. This is the live session. You can watch the recordings later and they won't be interactive, but you lucky people have the chance to interact with me tonight and also with Kim, our lovely facilitator, who is with us once again, and you'll see talking to you in the chat box, which is over there. I hope I'm pointing the right way. On the left side of your screen if you're on a computer of some sort. If you're on a mobile device, it's a bit hit and miss what sort of functionality you get, so good luck with that. But I encourage you to interact, and there's bits of tonight's session where you'll be able to kind of choose what direction we're going, so that should be fun. Now here's let me just turn my video off for a second so you can actually see what we're talking about. Here's an overview of the 7 sessions we've had in the course. That might ring a bell for you. We've done the first 6 already. Last week we crossed off getting better behaviour in the long term. And tonight you can see we're up to the final one there. So after tonight we'll have ticked them all off. Now where we're up to is basically the end of the course. So we've covered nearly everything about the functional assessment approach. Like I said, there's just a little bit extra that I'm going to add in. The other point I wanted to make about where we're up to is you're really just at the beginning. I mean, I know you've probably put in a lot of effort so far, and you might not like the sound of there being more hard work to come. But the one thing we know about learning new skills and changing your approach is that it doesn't happen automatically. And the bad news is you're probably going to forget most of what we've talked about in these webinars. So don't get complacent and don't feel bad about that. All I want you to do is have a bit of a plan for how you might refresh your memory at some point. We usually recommend about 3 months' time is a good chance to kind of refresh your memory and make sure you're up to speed on what you're trying to do, Because by that time you'll have forgotten a lot of stuff, and you'll maybe have formed some habits that aren't working so well. You might be able to come back and find some really useful stuff that points you in the right direction. So what I'd suggest is put maybe an entry in your smartphone or diary or somewhere in about 3 months from now. Maybe that puts us in February or March, saying revisit the webinars. Particularly this session would be a really good one to revisit, and you'll see why as we go through. But don't feel bad if you forget stuff. There's been a lot of content. I wouldn't be able to remember all this, and I deliver it for a living. Today's webinar, like I mentioned, there's going to be some new content, some refreshing stuff, lots of chances for interactivity. It's going to be a bit more relaxed because we don't have to power through as hard. We've got a smaller group, so there's more chance for me to deal with your questions or comments as we go through. So don't feel like you have to save your questions to the end this time. I'll be asking you for your input as we go through, and it'll be great to hear from you as we're doing that. By the way, I hope I'm coming through loud and clear. Let us know if it sounds all right to you or if it's not so great at your end. All right. So the first bit of new content that we want to cover is all about communication skills. Now, we've kind of touched on this a little bit so far, but hopefully it makes sense to you why this is important. When you're trying to manage your child's behavior, there's a lot that goes into that, and consistency is really important, including consistency across people. So it's useful to communicate what you're trying to do really effectively with other people, including other family members, maybe professionals, maybe teachers, childcare workers, siblings, anyone else. Also, it's quite possible that if there's tension around managing a child's behavior, you might need some skills in sort of diffusing that and trying to manage that proactively. So let's see what ideas we've got here. There's only a few of them. I'll turn off my video. Don't panic, I'm still here. The first point that you need to remember in communicating effectively is to use observational language. Now, you might have some ideas of what that sounds like. It basically means where you describe things in a specific sort of way rather than using generalizations. So the opposite of observational language will be something very general like, oh, you never listen to me, or we've had this problem so many times before, or why can't you just do it right? That would be very general. We want to do the opposite, which is more just describing things like, I noticed that we've had this behavior 5 times today, or I noticed that we talked about following through on this activity and we haven't done that yet, or I noticed that you were going to fix something and it hasn't happened yet. So it's just describing what's happened without including any judgment. Next, you want to try and include lots of I statements. That's a way of forcing you to talk about your own perspective. With a lot of these ideas, we're trying to get past defensiveness. You might have noticed if you're communicating with someone on a tricky topic, before too long you both end up with your backs up against the wall trying to sort of defend your position and what you want to happen, which ends up not being productive. Using an I statement is a way of getting around that by forcing you to just state your perspective and what's important to you and just hope that the other person understands. So if both of you are doing that, it tends to be much more productive. This is a great one to work on with a partner if you've got one. It can feel a bit funny at first if you're not used to doing it, so just be ready for that. But once you get used to the language, it can feel quite natural. The next one is active listening. This just means that when the other person's talking, you're not just sitting there staring at them with your arms crossed or scowling at them or giving them the evil eye or something. Instead, what you'll do is try and show that you appreciate what they're saying or that you're actively following along. So things like nodding and saying, oh yes, or mm-hmm, or oh, I see what you mean, or I understand. All those little phrases can actually make quite a big difference to how the conversation flows and how the other person feels while you're talking. And if you imagine trying to talk to someone about a tricky topic and they just sit there silently watching you, it can be quite off-putting. So it's a way of making people feel more comfortable and more willing to open up to you. And the final suggestion is to summarize what they're saying. Now you'll notice that a word is in capitals there. So we don't mean summarize what you're saying, we mean summarize what they're saying. This is our habit is usually to summarize what we're saying. You know, we'll make a few points and we'll say, right, so what I mean is we need to do this. All that tends to do is probably make the other person defensive or feel a bit frustrated. It can be really useful to summarize what the other person's saying, because then they're going to be on board with the idea that you're really listening, that you really understand, that you really appreciate their point of view. And the good news is you don't even have to agree with them to do this. So you can summarize in a way that says, so what I think you're saying is that we need to work harder on getting ready before we go out because we're always running late for things. Is that right? That doesn't mean that you agree with them. You might completely disagree. You're just summarizing what they've said as you understand it. All right? Now, does anyone have any questions or comments about communication? Or maybe you have some of your own ideas about communication, any tips that you've picked up or anything that you've noticed in trying to communicate, particularly within your family. This can work with kids too, or anything that you found particularly frustrating trying to communicate in your family, or any observations about what we've talked about. Let us know in the chat box if you have any comments to share about communication, because this is one of those ones where there's so much you could say about it. We could obviously talk for hours about communication skills and how to be productive working with other people. We just wanted to give you some basic ideas, but why not share your own? You might work in a kind of career where you do this and you might have much better ideas than me. So I'd love to hear from you. Type them in if you've got any suggestions. I'm going to keep moving on. Don't be put off by that if you do want to comment though. The next topic that we wanted to talk about is problem solving as a team. All right, so we're going to go through just a brief problem-solving routine. Again, this might be common sense to you. I'm not going to spend too long on it because for some people it'll seem like it's common sense and not that useful to you. But for others, it might be really useful just to kind of focus you and give you a structure that you can follow if you find that you're struggling to solve problems in your family. So I'll turn off my video again and let's have a look at some of the ideas we've got here. So first of all, it's important to identify just one problem. So obviously you need to, at the point of sitting down to discuss this as a family, you could get the kids involved, partner involved, whoever's involved in trying to find a solution to this problem. You want to know what the problem is. So make sure you, first of all, you say, right, here's what I think we're talking about. It's managing tantrums. Are we on the same page? And then you're ready to move on. Don't say, all right, we're going to deal with all the problems we've got around our son's behaviour, or we're going to deal with all our concerns about why we're arguing so much. Try and just make it one thing at a time. That way you'll be much more productive. Second of all, the next step is in the problem-solving routine is just to brainstorm solutions in a very open-minded way. You might be familiar with brainstorming. It just means everyone comes up with as many ideas as they can about something that might help deal with the problem, and you don't judge any of them just yet. You just collect them and say, all right, let's see how many we can get, and then we'll go through and work out which are the best. Then you go through those options and you consider the pros and cons. So what's good about each option, what's bad about each option. Then the next step that's really important is you're going to do a sort of trial and error procedure. So we're not just going to decide on the solution and that's it for the rest of time once we've worked out the pros and cons. Instead, you need to test it. You say, all right, well, this is what we think is going to work. Let's test that, and then we're going to have a better idea of whether it really is the solution. Okay, that's probably the most important step that gets left off, particularly with things like managing difficult behavior. You'll sit down, have a discussion and say, all right, this is how we're going to manage the difficult behavior. And then 12 months later, you won't have reviewed it. and you won't really have a sense of whether it's actually working or not. If you're to use functional assessment effectively, it's really important that you review your approach quite regularly, which means you're going to need a procedure like this, hence why we've included it in this course. Now, does anyone have any questions about that approach to problem solving? It's fairly simple. I don't think it's going to rock anyone's world, this idea, but I'm also interested in your ideas about how problem solving goes for you. Anything there that seems silly to you, or anything extra that you can add that seems to work for you? I'd be really interested in your ideas. I hope you like my background tonight, by the way. I thought I'd get cozy, even though it's quite warm at the moment. It was kind of the best Christmassy themed background I could find. All right, I think everyone's kind of on board with what we're talking about here. Everyone's reasonably happy with that. Thank you, Natalie. I'm glad you appreciate the background. It actually took a while to find. All right, so that's all the new content that we needed to cover for now. What we're going to do is move on to our review and kind of check-in and sort of problem solving for the rest of the session. Lots of chances for you guys to ask questions and check where you're up to and see if there's gaps in your understanding or bits that you want to add or contribute or discuss, okay? And I've tried to make this a bit interactive and fun by turning it into a choose-your-own-adventure through the exciting land of Functional Assessment Island. Let's see what this mysterious island has in store for us. All right, so we're going to embark on an adventure together. So imagine yourself in a tiny rowboat heading across the stormy seas to Functional Assessment Island. And we arrive on the shore, and we have our first steps to make towards using functional assessment effectively. Now, as I go through these, I want you to check off in your own mind how you're feeling about this topic, all right? And I mean how you're feeling without having to go back and review all the content. So do you feel like you really get this topic, you're ready to go, or are you like, not really sure what Tony's talking about there? Because if you're not sure at this stage, it's good to ask a question or make a note that you need to go and review that content. And these are also in a sort of an order that I've kind of made up based on what I think you need to focus on first. So last session we talked about quality time. Quality time is just the idea of spending time with your child for the sake of enjoying their company. And I put it to you that I think this is the most important place to start. In other words, if you're not having significant quality time with your child, it's going to be very hard to get better behavior out of them. And it's important to prioritize quality time for all sorts of reasons. So if you're not getting, at least 10 or more minutes a day of quality time which you're spending with your child, see if you can adjust your schedule to work that in. All right, let me know if you've got any questions about quality time, not sure what it is, not sure how to choose a good activity, anything like that. We can discuss it more. Next step towards functional assessment success is managing your own stress. I don't know if that's a surprise to you guys. I think that's super important, and in fact you can see real differences in how parents respond to children just if you get them to be more proactive and a little bit more selfish in managing their own stress level. I think it was last session, wasn't it, about ways of managing your stress. We gave you just some very basic ideas to start with. I think it was last session, wasn't it, about ways of managing your stress. We gave you just some very basic ideas to start with. If stress is a big issue for you, or you're not sure about any ideas to manage stress, or you've tried them all and they don't work, it's a good time to think about it now. Either raise it with me or seek some more individualized support. The next step is to catch your child being good. This is one of our sort of top 5 practical tips that we started the whole course with. You might remember that. All we mean by catching a child being good is just be on the lookout. Be a sort of a good behavior detective. And what we're trying to do is kind of reverse a tendency to notice the bad behavior when it happens. So if you if you have a child who has a lot of tantrums or other difficult behavior, that'll tend to be what gets your attention. What we need to do is make sure that your child actually gets more attention for doing the right thing than they do for doing the wrong thing. Melissa, you had a question about quality time, right? Let's just see what we can say about that now. It sounds like you've been putting in some really good effort into quality time, around 30 minutes at bedtime, as well as other times throughout the day. That sounds pretty good. But she still screams when it's bedtime and you have to leave the room, like she's never going to see you again, and she's almost 7. I would say quality time is probably not your problem there, and that you're doing a great job there. I would say we need to go through the whole functional assessment approach, see what the purpose of that kind of behavior might be, if it happens for other people, if it happens at other times of day, if it happens in other contexts, and kind of like triggers and consequences and all that sort of thing. So it could be quite complicated what's going on there, and could be something detailed about you know, how you're responding or how your daughter feels generally in the context of her environment. So the significant part of the context is a recent thing to do with your son and his medical treatment, and if it could have something to do with seeking attention. Yes, any kind of big change in your child's life, any sort of disruption to routine can have a big impact on behavior in ways that wouldn't necessarily make sense if you're not actively looking for it and trying to identify the causes of it. So things like separation between parents, or changing schools, or being really sick or hospitalized, or a new baby comes along. Any of those changes can lead to big changes in behavior. Whether or not they're to do with seeking attention, that certainly could be a big candidate, or it could be just struggling to adjust to the new routine or to the new life that they're living now. So I think that's probably a good candidate, Melissa, to explore. All right, now the fun part. At least I think it's fun. You guys might think it's pretty ordinary, but I think, let's see what you think. We've got a fork in the path. We have 2 options where the next idea is that you need to collaborate effectively, right? That's super important, that your family needs to be a team, or whoever's involved needs to be on your side, or at least understand what you're trying to do, and you need to have ways of working with them. So we just covered that today, but the idea is I can give you a few more details on one of these options. We can either go down the communication path, which we just covered, or we can go for the problem-solving path. And what I want you to do is, because we're a group expedition, we all have to follow the leader. We're not going to split up, or some of you lot are going to get lost, all right? So we're going to do this as a poll, and I want you to choose whether you want to take the communication path or the problem-solving path. And once we've had enough votes, we'll talk a bit more about the winning. All right, the votes are coming in. It's pretty close. All communication is ahead. Any last minute votes? I'll give you 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, the winner is communication. Let's see. I hope I have something worthwhile to say about that. So we've gone down the communication route. So I kind of already mentioned defensiveness, didn't I, in talking about communication. That's probably one of the most important points, I think. That one of your aims in communicating effectively isn't so much to worry too much about the particular words or ways of phrasing things that are going to really make the other person understand. Instead, you're trying to kind of break down barriers and overcome defensiveness. And that's really a big issue in parenting as well. It's easy to become defensive whenever someone talks to you about how you interact with your child or what you're doing to manage their behavior, even if that person's your partner or a relative, or perhaps especially if that person is a partner or a relative. And when you get into this pattern of defensiveness, it doesn't work for anyone, right? The result is just that both of you or all of you feel not listened to and hard done by. So what I want to encourage you to do, if you can, is to be a bit courageous and be the first to reach out with listening skills. All right. So if you find yourself in the middle of sort of an argument or a conversation that's not going anywhere, and you're trying to basically hit them over the head with your idea to get them to listen, try instead taking a deep breath and saying, all right, I'm going to be the one to reach out here with listening skills. Because listening begets listening and gentleness begets gentleness. So you can kind of inspire a different tone to the conversation if you do this really sort of skillfully or courageously. So sometimes it even means you have to sacrifice a particular point that you want to make in the moment in order for it to be heard eventually. So you might say, look, I've got this idea about managing tantrums that I think we've really got to do because this could make a huge difference. You might very well be right, but if the other person's not going to hear it, it's not going to make any difference. So you might have to let that go for the moment, establish a really good sort of listening communication style, and then you'll have a chance to bring it up again later in a much more effective way. Does that make sense to people? I hope that's useful to you. That's just kind of an extra 2 cents on communication. Now don't panic if you really wanted to hear about problem solving, if you voted for that. That's all going to be in the handout anyway, so you'll get all this content anyway. This is kind of we're choosing just for a bit of fun which one we go into detail in for the live webinar itself. All right, we've made it down our new path, and let's see where we're up to next. Okay, so you need to have an understanding of why tantrums happen. So remember our kind of psychologically based theory of tantrums based on frustration and becoming overwhelmed. That's really important. And it's also important to understand a bit of developmental psychology and not to treat your child like a little adult where you might try and reason with them or expect them to kind of be able to get themselves out of a tantrum. That's probably not very realistic. So make sure you've got an idea in your head about why tantrums happen. You don't have to be the world's expert on why tantrums happen, but just have a sort of working model of it if you can. So I hope you're ticking these off in your mind as you go through. And we're already at another decision point. So we need to get specific about behavior. Remember we talked about the telephone test? That's where this comes in, a super important idea. If you've got a lot of frustrating behavior going on, it tends to all blur together and we just say, well, you know, tantrums are the problem. I want to once again encourage you guys to be more specific about that, to describe some details about the tantrum around exactly what went on. And in terms of discussing this further, I'm going to give you 2 options that we're going to vote on here. These aren't very descriptive, by the way. I realize you might be looking at that and thinking, I don't really know what I'm going to get through either of these doors. Don't worry about that. It's just a bit of fun. So just choose either of those options. We can either talk more about what tantrums are, so I can tell you more about sort of that definition, or I can tell you more about the things that we wouldn't treat as tantrums or that need a different approach. Got lots of votes coming in already. I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's stop the voting there. I don't know if you guys can see that coming up as you're voting, but at any rate, it's a kind of a landslide, folks. 75% in favor of what tantrums are not. So let's go to that now. Of course, don't panic. You'll get the other information in the handout anyway. So here the idea was just I wanted to differentiate once again between the difficult behavior in tantrums that is causing problems versus your child's kind of emotional experience. It's a kind of a tricky one to differentiate. The whole of the tantrum is such an intense experience for everyone involved that it's just this flood of behavior and tears and screaming or whatever else is going on, and the child's overwhelmed and often you're kind of overwhelmed. But it's really important that our functional assessment approach really targets the parts of the behavior that are difficult for you and your family, so that cause problems in the child's environment. it's not such a good idea to target a child crying or being sad or being upset. The reason is that might be a perfectly valid emotion for the situation. And we don't want to teach your child that their emotions aren't valid or that they shouldn't be feeling the way they feel. Instead, if you remember our discussion about kind of the rock analogy with the waves crashing against it, or the Mona Lisa smile, where you're just kind of faintly pleasant and not too affected by the intensity of the emotions and everything that goes along with the tantrum, that's what we're aiming for. We don't want the emotion involved to matter too much to us. We want to act like, look, that's not a problem if you're too upset. But what is a problem is if you're hitting me, or you're hitting someone else, or you're not following instructions, or you're snatching things from other people, or you're screaming so loud that other people can't go about what they need to do. So all of those problem behaviors are perfectly valid to target. But if your child's having a tantrum and they're just kind of crying but not really causing any problems, I wouldn't target that too much with negative consequences. Because you can either just let them do that, or you can comfort them if you think that's okay and not going to reinforce any problem behavior. If you do think your child has a lot of problems with being upset or sad or anxious, and they seem to get in this kind of moody state very often, functional assessment isn't going to solve that for you. You probably need some different approach, which is where I'd encourage you to get more individualized support. Hope that makes sense to people. Let me know if you've got any questions or comments about that. All right, let's continue on our journey, this time through the forest of Functional Assessment Island. Next task that we need to do is identify high-risk situations. This has come up through a few of the sessions. But you need to choose, all right, in my family and for my child, what are the situations that seem to lead to tantrums most often? Because those are your high-risk situations, and you want to think about what it is that contributes to the high likelihood of tantrums in those situations. And you also want to have, of course, a plan for how you're going to tackle those high-risk situations, which we talked about a few times. Now, once you've identified those situations, you're going to look for common themes in the context, right? So you might do this on paper, or maybe you're particularly good at thinking about this in your head. I'd recommend writing something down. And look for common themes in the context. So remember things like who's there, what time of day it is, what's going on at the time, what they've been doing immediately beforehand, what happens immediately afterwards. And you're going to do that across a whole lot of tantrum situations and look for patterns. That's what's going to feed into our trigger behavior consequence analysis, and that's what's going to help you work out the purpose of the tantrum. I think you guys have probably done a fair bit of this already. We started it earlier in the course and we've revisited it a few times throughout. So I hope that's making sense to you. Any questions about analyzing the context? Let us know in the chat box. All right, let's continue through the forest. So once we've got that context analyzed, we have an opportunity to determine the purpose, don't we? This is a sort of a big moment in functional assessment, isn't it? So I'm going to bring myself back on the screen just to emphasize things. That's, I think, one of the strengths of functional assessment, is that it gives you an opportunity to maybe have some insight into why you're getting this very difficult, frustrating, tantruming behavior going on, or maybe why it's happening so much. And that then empowers you to have more of a targeted approach to dealing with the tantrum behavior, right? Otherwise, it's this kind of a scattergun approach saying, well, we'll just try some stuff and hopefully it'll work. It worked for someone else, maybe it'll work for my child too. Determining the purpose is what gives us a chance to be much more targeted and hopefully more effective in responding to the tantrum. And remember how we had those 6 possibilities? What's the best way to do 6 in fingers? That way? 6, 1? 6 possibilities. They come in 2 columns. On one side you've got seeking, and on the other side you've got avoiding. And the possibilities were sensations, activities, or attention. right? So hopefully you can fit the purpose of your child's tantrum into one of those categories. So either seeking attention, sensation, or activity, or avoiding sensation of activity or attention. If not, let us know in the chat. If none of those seems to apply, I'd be happy to try and help troubleshoot that with you. But remember, sometimes you have to adjust that as you go along. It's never an exact science, and you'll learn more once you've got an idea in your mind, kind of like a working idea. So that's what we need to do around determining the purpose. Let me turn my video off so you can see this properly. Then you need to think about how consequences affect the likelihood of that behavior happening again in the future. So remember how I go on about how, hey, there's no magic bullet, you're not going to solve tantrums just by responding in some super special way when they happen. You've probably heard me say that too many times, but it's the truth and it's really important. Consequences only affect the likelihood of future behavior, and they never completely control your child's behavior. You don't have that power, neither do I, neither does anyone. Unfortunately, your child has a big say in what they do. Annoying, isn't it? All you can do is set up consequences so that you're changing the likelihood of future behavior, either to be to get a higher likelihood of good behavior or a lower likelihood of bad behavior, or or the opposite if you're unlucky. So I hope that's making sense to people. Remember, as you're taking steps down this path, you need to have completed the previous steps. So if you're not sure, let's revisit that content. Now we have a chance to make another choice. Time to interact, folks. We need to talk about identifying a replacement behavior. So remember, once you have an idea of the purpose of your child's behavior, in this case tantrums, you have an opportunity to get in there and try and get something else happening instead. A replacement can fit a number of categories, but basically it's something to do instead. Rather than saying to your child, hey, stop that, or don't do that, which tends not to be effective, we want to say, hey, do this for me, do that for me. And that can be much more effective in changing a child's behavior. So let's do another poll here. Let's get a vote, see what people think. Are we going to go for choosing a replacement behavior? That's the first option. Or are we going to go for making a replacement behavior happen? Again, don't worry too much if you don't get your preference. We'll be able to review this in the handout, or you can go back and review the content that we've already covered. Both are very valid topics and very interesting, if I may say so, or at least I find them interesting. All right, a few seconds left. 3, 2, 1. Thank you for your votes, people. So for those of you who can't see, we've got about a 70% turnout in favor of making the replacement behavior happen, so that is our winner. Let's move on to that topic, making replacement behavior happen. Well, first of all, like I said, the bad news is you can't make it happen. Just like you can't actually stop tantrums using functional assessment, you can't actually make replacement behavior happen. All you can do is help it to happen. You might wonder why I'm making that distinction. Well, the reason is it helps to frame your whole approach. So for starters, you need to think about how doable that behavior is for your child. And we talked about this before, haven't we? But it can actually be quite hard to tell sometimes, particularly if your child's got additional needs or a disability of some sort. First of all, what they're capable of is likely to be different to other children. But it might be different in ways that you're not necessarily always able to observe. But even children who are typically developing will have differences from each other, and they'll certainly have differences from adults. So you might set up a task that you think is quite simple, like saying please, but for your child, for whatever reason, it seems to be quite hard for them to do. So then you need to use lots of sort of role modeling and demonstration. I also want to suggest that you should teach and practice the skill with your child, or break it down into its component skills. Remember how we talked about that in session 5, and practice it when they're calmer. So if you're trying to get your child to do a behavior when they're mid-tantrum or immediately after a tantrum or before a tantrum that they haven't practiced under better conditions, you're probably asking a bit too much of them. So I'd suggest, although it takes a lot of time investment from you, try not to skip the important step of teaching your child the replacement behavior during better times. All right, so if your replacement behavior is, let's think of another good one, maybe it's counting shops that you pass while you're at the shops instead of demanding things. You need to make sure that you're practicing counting with them under other circumstances, and maybe you can count buildings or something, so that it's a similar sort of idea, or look at pictures of shops and count them, so that once you actually get to the shops and then you're in that high-risk situation and under pressure, you're not asking your child to do something that they're not experiencing. All right, I hope that makes sense. It can be tricky to do. Sometimes kids aren't interested in doing that kind of practice. Sometimes they're really into it and they think, all right, this is interesting, let's do this anyway, it's kind of fun. But it'll vary a lot depending on the age of your child and their temperament. So that's some ideas on making replacement behavior happen. Does anyone else have any good ideas for that, around ways that you've maybe had success in getting your child to use a replacement behavior? Or just let us know how you're going with replacement behavior. That would be very interesting for me. But we'll move on to the next steps in our functional assessment journey through the island. So crossing the bridge here, the first rung, do bridges have rungs? Let's say the first step. The first step is to teach new skills. Now we just touched on that with identifying replacement behavior. This is kind of more general, that you might think, all right, this skill isn't exactly a replacement behavior, but it's probably related to how my child interacts with the world and the frustrations that come up with them, that come up for them. So we talked about things like some candidate skills and how you decide based on 6 criteria what a good new skill to teach is, but it was things like playing, entertaining themselves, fetching food or water, social skills, communication skills. All kids can benefit from those, but particularly kids who have a lot of problems with tantrums, and particularly kids with additional needs. Next, and we went through particular ways of teaching new skills. That was quite a big session, wasn't it? So make sure you revisit that if you're not sure about some of those ideas around demonstrating and guiding your child rather than just telling them what to do. Next, you need to have a system to track behavior over time. Remember, we talked about that. There are lots of options for you. My main point that I always want to emphasize is just choose one that works for you and that you reckon you can give a red hot go, rather than a very elaborate system that a psychologist like me is going to love, but you're not going to be able to keep up with, or you're going to be really annoyed at having to fill it out and it's going to be too much of a pain for you. So just choose something relatively simple and make sure that you can sustain it over time. So keep it going. Next, set good rules. Remember we talked about rules last session and we talked about them previously as well, but there are a few tips for good rules, like they don't do anything on their own. If setting really firm, strict rules and talking to your child about them is your only way of managing behavior and tantrums, it's probably not going to work. Rules are really just expectations, and they don't actually change behavior on their own. Lauren, you have a comment about teaching new skills using a milk jug, and also things to do with clothes and choosing what she wants to wear, etc. Those all sound excellent. And you can imagine, even just hearing about that, I can imagine the impact that has on your daughter around her confidence and around her enjoyment of day-to-day life, her role in the family, her self-esteem. And, I think that's a really good, you're doing really well there, and that certainly has the potential to make a big difference in tantrums. So setting good rules we've covered. Next step is plan routines for tricky situations. So identify those problem situations. Remember we talked about high risk ones. You want to have a routine in mind. That just means sort of a plan of attack before you get into them, and try and get everyone on board with what that planned routine is. So if the problem situation is when you go to playgroup, your toddler tends to have a tantrum most of the time, then develop a planned routine around, all right, what do I want to see my child do instead? What is the consequences if they do that? What is the consequences if they do the difficult behavior? All those things, how you're going to respond in the situation. Just make sure you're prepared ahead of time. So we've crossed the bridge and we've come to our next decision point. Which door are we going to go through, particularly relating to anticipating tantrums? Here we come to our concept of the behavior chain. Remember that one, folks? We talked about the behavior chain. We started off talking about trigger, behavior, consequence. Then we expanded that to say, well, you can look at the trigger of the trigger, and then the trigger of the trigger of the trigger, and you can keep going back in time and look at this whole chain of behavior. That's a really good thing to do to anticipate when the tantrum's coming, and maybe you can get in earlier. So there are two options for the doors you can go through. Again, don't worry if these don't mean much to you. You can just vote for one anyway. We're going to vote about anticipating tantrums. Let me know which door you think we should go through. Lauren, I noticed you also had an excellent comment around teaching skills to do with communication, and possibly also like emotional literacy, like self-awareness in your daughter. Those also sound like excellent skills, and I'm glad to hear that she's been able to pick those up. All right, we'll finish the voting there, I think, folks. We've got a good number of votes in. If you can't see it, it looks like we've got 2/3 in favor of what to do when you know a tantrum's coming. I guess I'm not really surprised by that. That's usually what parents are looking for in these kind of sessions. So some things that we've discussed previously are what I'd like to reiterate now. The best thing you can do is going to be modify or remove the trigger. So remember we had some content where we talked about different ways you can do that. Basically, if you can get rid of the trigger altogether, that's great. So you might be able to avoid that situation or remove some stimulus in their environment that is causing a child to be really frustrated. You might be able to identify things like tiredness that contribute, and you're like, all right, need to have a nap or need to do something to just chill out and relax for a while. It's not always possible, but if you can do it, that's great. Or if you can turn it into a trigger for better behavior, that's also awesome. So that's where you think of a replacement behavior that's kind of meeting the same purpose, and try and get that to be triggered instead. So for example, if we use some of Lauren's examples around maybe her daughter having tantrums, just as a guess, around getting dressed, the replacement behavior could be somehow getting involved in choosing clothes, and thereby we've kind of avoided the tantrum, which was frustration about something to do with the getting dressed process, maybe not liking the clothes. And the idea is, while you're trying to change the while you're trying to change the trigger, you kind of need to get in there for a while and act as the decision-making part of their brain, because when they're getting close to tantrum territory, you know your child's not going to be thinking all that clearly and making great decisions. So it's not much use wagging a finger at them and saying, let's make good decisions now at that point in time. You need to kind of get in there a bit and coach them usually. So once you know what you want them to do or how you want to change the situation, you need to get in there and do sort of lots of prompting and keep them engaged. It's kind of like you're quite involved, just trying to circumvent this tantrum before it happens. And that way you can kind of successfully, well, hopefully successfully transition out of that tantrum-provoking scenario. All right, thank you for your excellent comments, folks. Let's take the next steps on our functional assessment journey. We're nearly at the end, by the way. There's only one more choice to do. So we've talked about, we touched on modifying triggers there. That can reduce the likelihood of a tantrum occurring, which is definitely a good idea. And you want to prompt a replacement behavior. So that's also part of what we were talking about just now in anticipating behaviors. So you want to have a particular way of prompting that replacement. So remember, you're going to be specific and you're not going to use too many words. So you're just going to be something like, Joanne, I want you to you say please, or I want you to share your toy, or something like that. You also want to stay, yes, next step, you also want to stay calm, or as calm as possible. I know that's easier said than done. And ideally sort of faintly pleasant, like we don't want to have a big emotional reaction. Sometimes we fall into the trap of sort of using emotion to try and influence our child, maybe by getting sort of angry to get our point across, or maybe sort of sad to try and use guilt to get your child to change their behavior. Those sometimes work a bit in the short term, but they tend to be very unproductive in the long term, and they often set up worse patterns that you then have to try and undo. The best approach is really to stay calm, just faintly pleasant, not like you're not too bothered almost, and don't do too much talking. And it's also okay to intervene gently, so it's okay to physically, particularly if it's your child, you'd need to be confident in other circumstances, just to keep your child safe when necessary, but don't use physical punishment. So intervening is just about keeping them safe and other people safe. All right, next choice that I want you to participate in. This is the second last choice. We've got another one straight after it. We're going to talk about positive consequences. Now, this is just something that is going to reinforce the good behavior when it does happen. So particularly important for replacement behavior. But let me know, do you want to vote for, let me just find the right poll. Do you want to vote for attention, how to use attention as a positive consequence, or do you want to vote for a token economy, how to use a token economy as a positive consequence? If you don't remember what that is, that's something like stickers on a chart or little plastic tokens that you kind of give to your child to represent their good behavior and probably progress towards a bigger reward. All right, this is a landslide, folks. I'm just going to stop it right there. It's a bloodbath. It's all over. 100% votes for attention. Amazing. Let's go. So just to reiterate, attention is extremely powerful. I think often parents and others underestimate the power of attention, particularly because children will sometimes act like they're not responding to it. And we tend to assume, all right, we've got to get more concrete. We've got to get something physical that they'll respond to. That can be very effective if you use something like a token economy. But, so just remember, don't expect your child to react in the moment as though your attention is making a big difference, because they won't react the same way as they would to, say, maybe a new toy, like a big reward like that. But they can be just as effective, if not more so, in the long term. You as a parent or as a significant person in the child's life has a big role to play, and that really matters to the child, even if they act like it doesn't. Even children who have really extreme difficult behavior do actually care how the adults around them respond to them, even if they act tough or act like they don't care. So use your attention as one of the sort of most powerful weapons you have in your toolkit. The other good thing about attention is you're kind of killing two birds with one stone in a way. Remember how we talked about quality time earlier? Well, if you're spending some positive time with your child on an activity that they enjoy, that also counts as quality time. So you're both having extra quality time with all those benefits and using it as a way of reinforcing the good behavior that you've just gotten from your child, the replacement behavior. Especially if you're super busy and don't have a lot of time for quality time otherwise, it's a great way to use it. Yin, you're also commenting about how you're teaching a child about feelings and communicating about it. That's great to hear, and good on you for doing that. Let me know if you have any questions about positive consequences as we're going through, guys. I know we're getting close to the hour, but don't feel like you have to save your questions to the end if you've got them as we're going through. Our last decision point is about one of our last topics, which is negative consequences. So if you do get difficult behavior, tantrums, hitting, screaming, kicking, refusing to comply, you want to use a negative consequence for that most likely. It could be something as simple as planned ignoring, where you just don't respond to it, or you might want to use something like timeout or removal of privileges. So let's have a vote now and see which way people want to go. This is negative consequences. Let's see what you think. Ooh, this is a bit more of a close one, folks. Don't let your favorite lose. Get those votes in, or be forever disappointed. You've been warned. I'll give you 3, 2, 1. All right, the winner by a nose is timeout. If you're keen on removal of privileges as a negative consequence, just check the handout or recap previous sessions. So we'll talk about timeout. We're not going to go through the whole approach. We've done that previously. This is just kind of a few tips. So just to reiterate, be careful what you read about timeout. If you want to explore more about it or you want to refresh your memory, I can vouch for kind of the content that I've delivered to you, but not what other people will tell you about timeout. And I've read lots of stuff online from people you would think are quite reputable and know about it, but they describe something that isn't timeout and probably isn't going to work. So make sure you do things like, well, good timeout you'll be able to tell because first of all it's quite simple and it's quite unemotional and you don't do a whole lot of talking in it. So remember those things that I said timeout isn't. It's not about shaming your child. It's not about making them feel guilty. It's not about insisting that they apologize. It's not about making them sad or unhappy. None of that is necessary or even a recommended part of timeout. And the other part is just stick to your guns afterwards. So sometimes a mistake that people make is they put their child in timeout, they get through that, it goes okay, their child calms down, but then they come out of timeout and they do the difficult behavior again. Like they go in timeout for hitting their sibling, they go in there, they have their timeout, they come back out, and 2 minutes later they hit their sibling again. And sometimes the parents are like, oh, it didn't work, or I can't deal with this again, or this is too much. The problem is you really need to put them back in timeout when that happens, because consistency is super important. All right. Oh, Andrew, you're on a roll with the polls. I'm sorry to hear that. That you missed the last one. All right, that is the last poll. Let's just see the last few things I want you to check that you've got in place, or whether you've got questions or further investigating to do. First of all, you are going to record tantrums as they happen in your behavior tracking system. Remember we said that you need to have that set up. Well, then you need to actually use it. So as your child has a tantrum soon afterwards or that night or something, you need to make an entry in your behavior tracking system. Then you've got to look at the data that you're collecting and review that from time to time to see if the tantrums are going up or down. Try not to skip this step. If you think everything's going fine, why not review the data and celebrate a bit and give yourself a pat on the back? Or if they're kind of up or down, by reviewing the data you can maybe tell something about what was going on, like, oh, maybe we had a relative visiting in that time, or he's been sick a lot lately, or we've had these problems with sleep in that time when tantrums were really bad. Anything along those lines is going to be really informative to you. The final step that I haven't really covered explicitly in the course so far is the importance of a growth mindset. Now, this might not be familiar to you. It's very popular in education, sort of popularized by a researcher called Carol Dweck and the books that she's written. But it's a very useful idea. It's just the idea that if your child isn't doing something, or they don't have a skill, or they're not following through on a behavior, or you're not successfully following through on things you want to do with managing a child's tantrums, just frame it in your own mind that it hasn't happened yet. It doesn't need to be such a big deal that it's not happening right now. There's always potential to do it in the future. So as long as you've got a growth mindset, you can be working towards something rather than stressing too much about where you are right now, because there's definitely opportunities around tantrums for improving what you're experiencing. All right, this is the exciting part of the evening, ladies and gentlemen. We've made it to the end of our journey through Functional Assessment Island, and we get to the treasure chest at the end of the journey. Can anyone guess what might be in the treasure chest? All this effort that we've put in, all the effort that you've put in over 7 weeks now, 7 hours of listening to me talk, putting in your own effort at home. Really impressed with you guys, and thank you again. Andrew's got a suggestion, sleep time. That is a well-earned reward and something that I think we could all appreciate. Well, it's not all that exciting. It's just kind of fewer tantrums, so, which is nice, right? It's not even no tantrums, though. That's not something I can promise you. It's just less. That's what you can hope for if you use this functional assessment approach consistently. So that could make quite a big difference in your life, couldn't it? Even just reduced tantrums is a worthwhile thing to aim for. Lauren wants a massage. That would also be very nice. Functional assessment can't provide that for you, though. Maybe someone else can. Or maybe go and get one. You deserve it. Lauren. Now, I just wanted to make a few mentions of our kind of most stalwart people who have put in effort by attending every session of this course so far. So I'm just going to turn off my screen while I read these out, because you guys are superheroes. Not that the rest of you haven't done an amazing job, but particularly wanted to give a shout out to these people. I'm just going to check which ones of them are here tonight. By the way, if you are here, if you have been to all 7 and I don't call your name, let me know. So first of all, we had Andrew. You have been to every session so far. Well done. Congratulations and thank you. Next, we had Marsha. You're here. Nice to see you again. Thank you for participating every session. What an effort. Melissa, you're here also. Thank you. Thank you for participating. It's been great to have you. Natalie, you have also been here every session. Well done. I know we have more than one Natalie, but you'll know who you are. Penelope, you have also been to every session. Thank you. Well done. Rebecca, you've been to every session. Thank you for being here. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Lauren, I know we have more than one Lauren, but you know who you are. Well done, Lauren. And last but not least, Samantha. Thank you, Samantha, for being here every session. You guys are legends, and I hope it's been useful to you. The rest of you, also great job for being here, as many as you've been to, or if you're only just watching these in recordings, that's okay. I also appreciate that. Now, as per usual, that's all the content for the entire course. We're going to have our feedback survey. Kim's been busily sharing the link to that in the chat, and you can see a link to it on the screen, hopefully. We always appreciate your feedback on these sessions. That will be about session 7 in particular, and we'll look at that as we do session by session. So if you have time to complete that either now or when I end the session, or will load in your browser, that would be much appreciated. There will also be coming around by email a follow-up questionnaire, a bit of one that takes about, how long is it, about 3 minutes, 5 minutes, something like that, which is about the whole course. So you would have had the opportunity to complete that at the start. If you did that, you'll also get a reminder email to do a follow-up, which would be very much appreciated. We haven't done that before, so it's our first time collecting these data about how useful the overall course was to people. So watch out for that in your email if you are willing to complete that for us. A reminder about if you're concerned or upset, use those links there. You will get another recording or handout, the final one for the course later this week. Now, it is time to go for the course overall. I'm going to stick around for questions as usual. If you do have to go, don't feel bad about that. I'd like to say thank you for participating if you have to go now. It really has been a pleasure talking to you folks, and I really, even though it's not at the most convenient time, I always look forward to having the chance to talk to parents about these kind of tricky challenges. I hope it's been useful. Now, let your questions come rolling in, or not, if I've solved all your problems and answered all your questions for you. What I'll do is I'll just pause my video for a moment and turn my audio off. I'll turn on some thinking music, some background music, and then I'll be back in like a minute or two to answer some questions. Well, probably less than a minute, I think. Oh yeah, I didn't have my microphone on. Thanks, Melissa. I was just talking about the background music and what fun that was. So we have a question from Natalie about having tantrums all of a sudden at swimming when it sounds like that wasn't happening previously. It sometimes can be hard to tell, Natalie, and sometimes it's just kind of like a developmental thing. You won't always be able to see what's going on. I guess the information that you have is that it's happening at swimming in particular, and possibly while you're there. Although I don't know what to make of that if no one else takes them. So you might be able to work something out about that environment, what it is about swimming that seems to be triggering these tantrums. Is there any particular timing to it? Is it like when you get there, when your son's about to get in the pool, when they're expected to follow instructions? So it could be something to do with maybe the sensation of being in the water. It could be something to do with like the activity. Some society just doesn't like swimming. It could be something to do with the tension. In this case, I wouldn't worry too much about the what's caused it to come on suddenly. I don't know how fruitful that would be. It's probably better to just go through the motions of like, all right, we've got these tantrums happening. Let's try and work out the purpose, try and come up with some replacement behaviors, try and get those happening, provide positive consequences when they do, negative consequences when you get the difficult behavior like refusing to participate or whatever else your son does at swimming. I'm not sure if that helps, Natalie. Samantha, thank you for participating and for your nice comments. Yin, thank you for your nice comments. Emily, also thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Marsha, thank you for your comments. Andrew, yes, may the tantrums be few and far in between for you also. All right, we've got lots of lovely comments from people. Natalie, I'm sad it's over too. All right, I don't think we've got any further questions at this stage. It's likely that at some point in the future we'll be running similar webinars again, so you can save up those questions or revisit the content that we've had in the past. I do encourage you to use those recording links or the handouts. Like I said, don't expect to be on top of this straight away. It is a tricky thing to do. I'm a parent myself, and I have to think hard about how I use these approaches. They don't necessarily come naturally. So be patient with yourself and be kind to yourselves. And best of luck with managing tantrums and all sorts of behavior, and also enjoying your parenthood and your child. That's our last session. Thanks for being with me, and all the best for the future.